introduction of myself. My name's Stephen Perez. I live in sort of Luton. No, not Luton, Bedfordshire. Luton, Chatham Central, in Medway for those. Medway Plus, just a quick sort of bit of information about Medway Plus. Medway Plus was founded in May 2015 by some ex-Medway Council employees. It was mostly set up because the council decided at that point to not sort of do, to not look to do any more European projects. So the members of that team were sort of made redundant, and they sort of formed Medway Plus. The basic aims of Medway Plus is around sort of creating community associations, community groups, empowering and strengthening sort of residents, increasing sort of more participation, and managing projects. So which sort of leads us to where we are today with the Luton Urban Trees project. So look, the other partner with Medway Plus is Arches Local, and I sort of sit in both camps. Arches Local is a big local group. For those of you that are familiar with what Big Local is a sort of lottery funded project, 150 areas, resident driven. Arches Local is one of those. Big Local sort of overarching sort of outcomes are around sort of communities being better able to identify local needs and take actions to respond to them. The people locally will have sort of increased skills and confidence. The communities will be able to make a difference to stuff that they sort of prioritise, and sort of just in a sort of nutshell that people will feel that their area is a better place to live. So I live in the Arches Local area, as does Jackson, who sort of lives right in the middle of it on Luton Road. I'm sure he won't mind me saying. And I think I kind of like, sort of that gives a sort of general overview of what we are, but in a nutshell, we're not sort of experts or anything of that nature. We're just sort of local people that have sort of got involved in sort of wanting to make where we live better, which I'll sort of hand over to Jackson to sort of run us through the slides.
Absolutely. So if we start, I might as well introduce myself. So obviously my name's Jackson Fraser Haig. I'm Arches Local's campaign officer. So I'm involved in a lot of their long-term projects, whether that's urban greening, whether that's physical regeneration or neighbourhood plans. That's the sort of things I'm involved in. So if you go on to the first slide, we'll give you a little breakdown of, see it's compressed a little bit at the bottom there, but thankfully I've got it open on my end so we can see it fine. So what is LUTS? So essentially, LUTS is Luton Urban Trees. So we consult year round and have done since Arches Local has sort of existed. And one of the things that keep coming up in consultations is we need more green spaces. And of course, we can't magic up a green space. We have one of the densest populations in the southeast. So one of the projects we started looking at was, how do we green our pre-existing spaces? How do we look at, rather than getting people to the green space, how do we bring it to them? And that's essentially what Luton's Urban Trees is. So it's a community-inspired and sustained urban tree campaign where the locations have been picked by local people, where the trees will be planted by local people, and most importantly for tree planting, they'll be maintained by local people. So Luton Urban Trees plants 30 trees throughout some of the most important locations in our boundary, which are typically defined by the closest to where people live and the closest to high and busy transport areas. Each tree is planted, staked, and supplied with a watering bag and caged. Now, as with many projects, we had planned, and we were sort of going like the clappers in February of this year. Of March, we came out with scanners and more stuff that I'll cover on later on. And of course, COVID struck. So there we had sort of 50 t-shirt designs, various different programs to have a huge planting day. And of course, under the guidelines, it couldn't go ahead. So we reassessed the situation and we put a date in the calendar for National Tree Week, which is November the 21st, running all the way to the 1st of December. Now, the exact look and feel of each planting day will ultimately be decided by COVID and the government. So it may be, rather than 45 members of the local community and local schools coming out and planting the trees, it may be, okay, we allocate site 27, we dig the hole, we ran the stakes in, and then we invite a family or a bubble round to plant the tree in the ground. So so it needs to obviously be as sort of COVID and as community friendly as possible. And of course, more often than not, those two don't coincide. But if we move on to slide 3, I can tell you why LUTS is very important. So of course, the idea of planting 30 urban trees isn't sort of rocket science. And it's not groundbreaking in many areas, but it is precisely for the areas that are going to be planted in. So LUTS is planted in an area of Chatham Central known as Luton, as Stephen described, and it's one of the most deprived areas nationally. So the index of multiple deprivation looks at 32,000 areas. More often than not, our boundary falls into the bottom 10%. And sometimes it's 10 or 20 from the most deprived in certain areas. It's within an AQMA, which I've got there, an air quality management area. So that's when the council, in this particular case, Medway Council, looks at what areas have got worrying levels of pollution or illegal levels of pollution. And they mark that boundary. And it doesn't mean you're going to do anything, an air quality management area. It just means you're going to look at it. You're going to monitor it over time and see how that changes. And as I touched upon in the first slide, we're really high dense. So it's Victorian terraced housing converted into flats. So for example, it's just me in my house, but my neighbour has 8 people living there. And it's a 2 up, 2 down Victorian terraced house. So, and we have low mobility. And I think that's one of the biggest difficulties. And for climate change, it's a good thing. So 43% of our households don't own a car. But if you look at actually where they're living, some of you may wish they owned a car. Because of the air quality, the population density, the depravity, sometimes you wish they were able to leave the area. But sadly, they're actually sat in it. So if you go to the next slide, I can go and take you through the journey that we've been on. So as I touched on before, we had endless community consultant. And then the first part was, okay, so who actually owns the land where we are? And strangely, a lot of it isn't owned by the council. So it's owned by a private company called MHS Homes, which acquired a lot of the council housing, I believe around 2 or 3 decades ago. So the journey really began with them saying, look, the community want to do this. We've got funds from yourselves and from Arches Local, and we pull them together to create this urban tree campaign. Where can we do it? Where can we find a location that's really important to people, really important to the local schools and to the highways network that you own? And we came up with a selection of locations that are ideal, really. They didn't seem ideal at the time. They're ideal on reflection. So then the process started. So we got Southern Drilling out, which is a Rochester-based firm, to ensure that we didn't basically penetrate anyone's virgin media while we're planting these trees. And one thing we quickly came and found was that despite the map tells you there's no cables or utilities in the green verge, ultimately in our case, they were meaningless. So we'd have, on paper, we'd have this nice clean run with no utilities in it. And the poor gentleman scanning it, his scanner lit up like a Christmas tree. And of course, there was everything under the sun in there. So once we agreed whose land it was, once we found the locations, the 30 locations where we could actually physically put them and avoid utilities, we had another consultation again. So with those where it's within 30 foot of their door, those that are going to be on the walking route through schools through there, our partners in Medway Council, because some of them butt up to their pavements. So then if we go on to the next slide, I was lucky enough to visit the largest containerised tree nursery in Europe. And that was fantastic. I wasn't really too sure how what a tree nursery would look like, but I wasn't expecting something to be that ginormous. And they were our suppliers. So when we spoke to MHS Homes, when we spoke to the council, we said, look, who's our go-to? Sort of excuse my naivety, but we had no idea who to get it from. And of course, they recommended Marchands. And of course, they went through the process of why you should avoid importing certain trees from certain countries. And ideally, you want them all grown in the UK and ideally containerised so that you aren't too precious about the weather. So that was all. So as far as we're concerned, the donkey work was all over then. Now it's about the fun stuff. So what T-shirts can we design for local school children? What tree adoption packs can we put together? And of course, one thing we didn't expect to happen is when we were marking the locations in February, late February, of course, we wasn't expecting a global pandemic. So one of the things we had to do was to remark every other week the tree planting locations, because otherwise we'd have to repeat the scanning process. So we go into the next slide. It shows you how important or what Luton's urban trees can achieve. So they say a mature tree can absorb up to 150 kilo of CO2 per year. And if we're basing it on the assumption that all these trees will grow miraculously into fine specimens of trees, then that'll be over 4 tons every year that's produced. And from the Luton area, that's really significant. We have a tree deficit locally, so more trees are being felled than being planted. And that's not just in Luton, that's in Medway wide. It encourages biodiversity. So trees were picked based on their ability to thrive in tough urban environments like ours, but also the ability to create a wildlife corridor for certain insects and other animals to thrive. And as I touched upon previously, one of the reasons why we're so keen to work with MHS Homes was because you had 2 primary schools at either end of a big slice of their land, and you'll see it coming up in the final slide. And that's where we're going to do the majority of our planting. So now you have a conscious effort, conscious decision as a school child or as a parent to take your kids directly down a green route, which won't take you any longer than going down a road. And I believe the Luton Road, Luton Arches Junction has around 28,000 cars passing through every day. So they have a direct conscious effort to take a green route and navigate those busy polluted roads. So we go on to the next slide. We've done some renders. So of course we haven't planted them yet. They're ordered, they're coming, but we haven't planted them yet. So rather than show you the before and none of the after, we thought we'd get up Photoshop and produce some renders to give you a rough idea. So of course the left-hand side is before, the right-hand side is after. Now I must admit, I did edit the sky. It is the same photo. Now obviously those trees are mocked in, and that's roughly the sort of size they'll be. So they're extra heavy standard, 2 meter clear stem, and then 2 meters on top of that. And the next slide should show you what they could be like in 2030. And of course, this is hugely significant for them area, because if you look around on that photo, you're hard to find a sort of thriving tree. They don't really exist. And if they are, they're sort of on their way out. So it's really important for this area. And I believe we have another before and after on the following page, which is literally just around the corner. So if we were to turn around on one of these photos, well, of course we can't, but if we were to turn around in person, you would see a church, a food bank, and a primary school. So once these trees are established, you literally have a green lung in the middle of a very polluted area, and it'll be fantastic. So on the final 2 slides, we've given you a sort of digital sort of bird's eye view of where the trees are going to be planted. So if you see where it says Friday's Fish and Chip Shop in the orange little icon there, that's Luton Road. So one of the busiest, most densely populated roads in Kent. And now, up till in a couple of months, that would be the normal walk for the 2 primary schools. So if you went left at Luton Tyres, you would go to New Road and All Saints. And if you went right, you go to Luton Primary School. That was the offer. Whereas now you're able to navigate down Castle Road and along Lismos Road, and it'll be a thriving green route, not just for school children, but people that live there. We know that obviously urban trees lowers cortisol in people's brains, the stress hormone. We know it improves house prices. We know it slows traffic down. So there's many, many positive reasons to this. And the final slide is just, I believe, 6 or 8 trees that are in Maida, so in a really popular cul-de-sac. And I believe that's it. If you have any questions or anything else you'd like to ask, feel free to fire.